Imam Latif.
Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you to the coordinators and organizers for allowing me to be a part of such an esteemed panel. I have no scholarship in the legal field whatsoever, and I just put that out there as a disclaimer. I'm also not Catholic, if you can't tell, but hopefully there'll be something insightful to add to the conversation. I think it's very opportune that actually, my piece is coming after the previous presentation, in that I think anecdotally and experientially, I could share some insights with you in terms of really what the Muslim experience is like today, just in terms of things that I've gone through. One of the critical things that I would argue would need to be understood is in dealing with this idea of religious freedom and our society being a society that is increasingly becoming diverse. That diversity in and of itself is not something, as was mentioned, that necessarily yields tolerance, and that intolerance becomes a greater obstacle than sometimes what we realize prevents us from really harnessing pluralism in the truest sense of the word. And I think the biggest impact that it has is not necessarily on those who are espousing the intolerance, but more so how it justifies a passivity and a sense of indifference towards those who have the ability to do something about the intolerance. The effect that comes from otherizing so many populations that exist as minority groups within our diverse nation, our diverse society, is something that really has to be understood. And speaking now from the standpoint of a Muslim and how the religion of Islam has been essentially racialized, and the effects of that can be felt by many who are not even of the faith, but just because they come from a specific cultural background or ethnic background, essentially have a certain shade or tone to their skin color, they are now fit into this group. So to give you an example, some of my students and I were on 6th Avenue and we were eating at one of the street vendor carts. And we had about 10 of us that were standing in front of the cart, and there was an elderly woman who was Caucasian that was at the back of the line who, I guess, decided she didn't need to stand in line. So she's going through the pack saying, "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me." And as no one is moving out of the way, she's muttering to herself, "Don't you understand what I'm saying? I'm asking you to let me through. Don't you get it?" And then she stops right in front of me at the front of the line, and when she sees me, she says, "Oh, I guess you don't get it. How do you say 'excuse me' in your language?" And I said, "We say 'excuse me.'" And she said, "No, the country that you come from, how do they say 'excuse me'?" And I said, "I'm from New Jersey, and we say 'excuse me.'" And I think this is where the distinction comes in terms of the materials that I was graciously provided in preparing for the panel today, in that when those who are dealing with this issue historically, in terms of the Catholic community finding its roots, were being told that they don't belong here. They were made to feel that they don't belong here. Many of them actually had come here from someplace else. But when the reality of this otherization comes upon many Muslims, the fact is we don't have any place else to go because this is where we're from. And when we're dealing now with this racialization of the faith, and it defines Muslims as being someplace from 500 years in the past or 500 miles away, it really neglects this idea that many of us just have our roots and our heritage here. And what becomes problematic is not just the day-to-day interactions. I could care less if some woman on the street thinks I'm from some other country. But now when policy begins to reflect a sense of institutionalized racism, where we see individuals being treated in a way for no other reason that they look a certain way or they espouse a certain face, that they actually are in fact treated as being suspect. I work for the New York City Police Department. I have the rank of an inspector, which is a pretty high rank. It's one rank below a one-star chief. I constantly consult for the State Department. I've had numerous meetings and consultation opportunities for different parts of government. In this building, actually, a few rooms over, I had lunch a few years ago with John Brennan before he addressed many people from the law school as well as community from our Islamic Center, an event that we hosted with the White House. And I only say that not to say that look at where I'm at, but understanding where I'm at, because the reality of the circumstances, even me coming from these connections and these places, I find myself regularly succumbing to a different kind of treatment because of the faith that I espouse. For a good 4 years, anytime that I would land on an international flight, I wouldn't be able to even get off of the airplane. But when the plane would land on the runway, the announcement would go up that have your passports ready because TSA is going to do a random check. And essentially, I was the random check. And when I would get to the door, there would be 2 TSA workers looking at every passport, and when they would come to mine, the one who would find mine would say to the other that I've got him, and then they would escort me into a room where I was detained for 4 to 6 hours. That room was full of individuals who were minorities. They were in a place where they were just there. And the questioning and the interrogation was such that for many who didn't necessarily have the language skills and didn't necessarily understand what was going on, it was that much more harrowing of an experience. For me in particular, I went through circumstances where my belongings were gone through and everything was inspected. I couldn't travel with electronics because if I did, my memory and databases would be downloaded and it would add another 2 hours to my detainment. And when they would find my police credentials or my State Department credentials or folders that had huge gold eagles embossed on them, and they'd get frustrated and say, "Why are we stopping you?" And I would say, if you don't know, how am I supposed to know the answer to that question? And after it happened consecutively, a few weekends in a row, where I came back from our campus in Abu Dhabi and I was in Sweden for a conference in some other place, and the same people had now interviewed me over and over, I asked one of them, "What do you think the issue is?" And he said, "You're young and you're male and you're Muslim. And these 3 things don't go that well together right now." Getting on to domestic flights was an event in and of itself as well, where my boarding pass prints with 4 S's, signifying that I'm a security threat. And the feeling of isolation and alienation that stems from these places is something that has to be understood as well, because now when the call goes from the worker who's calling their advisor that we have a security threat, it's not done with subtlety. My belongings get put into a red bin as opposed to the gray or white bin that everybody else's belongings get put into. And I get escorted through the metal detector and then taken into a contraption that looks like a phone booth, but essentially has 3 walls, and where the 4th one would go, a bar drops behind you in case you want to run away or something. And then a gentleman from the TSA comes and says, "Mr. Latif, we're going to perform an extended pat down on you today. We're going to put our hands all over your body. When I get to your neckline and your waistline, I'm going to use my finger to go around it. And when I come to your more sensitive areas, such as your backside and the inner part of your groin, I'm going to use the back of my hands instead of the front of my hands. Are you okay with this?" I'm like, "Yeah, I wanted to get molested on my way to Cincinnati today." Everybody that I'm going to get on the plane with sees this happening. And everybody who's standing in line sees this happening. And you remove now someone who is kind of as pompous as myself, and you put into my place a 70-year-old grandmother whose 13-year-old son is watching this, grandson is watching this happen to her. Or I've seen women who are 7 or 8 months pregnant who are sitting in these situations while their husbands who can't speak English are just a few feet away but behind a door, and they don't know what's going on. And you think of kind of the anxiety and the feeling of isolation that stems, and really, why is that the case? Why is that happening? Because when I land and I come off of the plane, I still have an American passport. And what I teach my students in the classes I teach on multi-faith leadership here at the university is, does that really represent the social contract that it's meant to represent for people who are citizens of this country, where I can't even get off of a plane when I land in the city that I live in for the last 13 years of my life?
And what does that really mean in terms of the policies that enable us to get to that point and the individuals who are creating those policies, and how come nothing's being done about it? In my capacity as chaplain for the police department, one of the things that I do every year is go to the 9/11 memorial. And we have breakfast with family members who lost loved ones on that day, and we then go from the police headquarters to the ground zero site. And we're in a VIP section for family members and city officials, and I'm in my inspector's uniform, but I still have my beard and I'm wearing my skull cap. And on the 9th anniversary of the attacks, I'm standing, waiting for the ceremony to start, and there's people who are mingling around me and we're talking, and 3 men approach me in suits saying that Secret Service has identified you from the top of a building. They want us to check your credentials just in case. I say, just in case what? And they say, we're sorry that we're doing this to you. I said, then why are you doing it? And what's being questioned at that point in time is not only my literal presence at that site, but the entire emotional validity that I have to that place. I was an undergrad at New York University on September 11th, and for those of you who might have been here at that time too, I stood with about 10 or 12,000 of my classmates in the Washington Square Park. The Kimmel Center down the street wasn't there, the Spiritual Life Center wasn't there, and you could see the World Trade Center. And all of us were watching as the second plane flew into the building. And we all went in our directions, and the reality of the aftermath of that attack for me was something that was still my own experience. I prayed at funeral prayers for individuals who were Muslim and people who were not Muslim. Much of the work that I have has been informed by the atrocious attacks of that day, and so much else has informed where I am in my life. And this guy is saying to me what he's saying and questioning all of the validity of the emotion tied to it. And the frustrating thing is not that you go through it, but you can't really do anything about it. Because if I said, no, I'm not going to go and get an extended pat down, or no, you can't detain me when I'm coming back into my own country, or no, I won't show you my credentials to prove that the uniform that I wear is actually my own and I don't have some heinous plot. If I said anything, it'd just make the circumstance worse. There's a Latino woman that was standing next to me who lost her son on September 11th. And where no one else spoke and everyone else watched, she now said to this man that what you are doing is more dishonorable to the memory of our loved ones that we lost on that day than anything else. That here you are questioning this young man and making it seem as if he is doing something wrong by standing with us in our moment of need just because he's Muslim. And instantaneously that emotional validity comes back. And to me, I would say that that woman embodies a pluralistic worldview. That when she has the opportunity to understand really how power dynamics play out, and where she is uniquely poised to offer something, not with an understanding that this narrative is victimized in any way, but I think just dealing with the reality of circumstances. Who else could say something to that person other than she without there being repercussions? And why was it that anyone else who was in her position wasn't saying it, but she was the only one? This is a question that Muslims are dealing with today. As we are institutionally young and we find ourselves in a place where the reality is such that many policies do have us treated in a way where we are not treated the same as others. You know, we do an annual trip between our center and the Jewish center on campus here where we take Muslim and Jewish students to do relief work. And this past winter, we went down to Joplin, Missouri, where they had been hit by tornadoes about a year ago, and there was a lot of issues still for people on the ground there. And we visited a community that had a mosque that was just burned to the ground. And they were now being relocated to a different place, and the city was helping them find new land and to rebuild, and everyone was helpful in that sense. And when I sat down with people from the community, they were still really sad because they said, we wanted to build on the land that we owned. And the city told us they couldn't guarantee our protection if we stayed there. How is that equitable? How is that something that demonstrates that we have an equal treatment of citizens of our country? You can't build your house of worship in the place that you own because we, as the governmental apparatus, can't ensure your protection, that somebody might do something to you. And that's a big problem, at least in my opinion. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I could assume that's not the way it's supposed to be. And so I'll end with this in terms of experientially where it is. One of my students came to see me the day after Osama bin Laden was killed. And he went down to the Ground Zero site. He's an undergrad at New York University, just like the other 30, 40,000 kids that are here. And he's sitting in my office and he said, I went down there just to see what was going to happen, and all these people were chanting and they had signs and they were celebrating, and it was, "We got Osama, death to Osama, we killed Osama, 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 Osama." And he's sitting on my couch and he's crying. And he says, "My name is Osama." And I just wonder if anybody here is going to ever really understand or get what it's like for me to be living here. When I read the brief that was sent, or the essay that was written by Walsh on the case, it was really interesting, the parallels experientially as I read his words in terms of things that I've personally felt. And then when I tried to digest it a bit, it didn't necessarily make me feel good. But I don't understand how it kind of just replicates itself. Why I share a personal narrative with you is that as much as I'm seen as an antidote to many things, I work for a governmental apparatus as a Muslim chaplain, and I'm sure you could have a field day on separation of church and state that I'm hired by the NYPD to work for them. And the State Department sends me all over the world as the quote-unquote representative of American Islam to Muslim communities. Look at what our Muslims are like. But even there, when I'm seen as an antidote, I'm still seen as a poison. And the treatment is still different, and it's not based off of anything else other than the fact that I ascribe to the faith that I ascribe to.